Human remains were discovered inside the fuel tank of a commercial airliner during routine maintenance, yet no passenger was reported missing from any flight. The technician who made the gruesome discovery described finding what appeared to be human organs floating in the aviation fuel, organs that should not have been there. But the most disturbing detail of all? No crash had been reported, no body was ever found, and to this day, the victim remains unidentified. James Harlow had been working as an aviation maintenance technician for over 23 years. In all that time, servicing aircraft at Denver International Airport, he had never encountered anything that couldn't be explained by physics, mechanical failures, or human error. A seasoned professional who had inspected everything from small private planes to massive commercial jets, Harlow was known among his peers for his methodical approach and unshakable composure. That was until the morning of November 12, 2023, when everything he thought he understood about his profession and reality itself was challenged. The day began like any other at the maintenance hangar. It was 6:15 in the morning, the air crisp with the approaching winter. A Boeing 777-300ER, operated by Transglobal Airways, had been brought in for scheduled maintenance following reports of fuel consumption inconsistencies during its last 3 international flights. The aircraft, registered as N778TG, had been in service for 11 years without any major incidents. The captain had noted in the logbook that the plane seemed to be burning through fuel at an unusually rapid rate, particularly during the cruise phase of flight, the period when fuel consumption should be most stable. Harlow and his team were tasked with inspecting the fuel system, starting with a visual examination of the tanks. The Boeing 777-300ER has multiple fuel tanks, a center tank, and left and right main wing tanks, with a total capacity of over 47,000 gallons. To access these areas, maintenance crews need to enter confined spaces through access panels that are not much larger than a small suitcase. "I remember thinking it was going to be a straightforward day," Harlow later recounted to investigators. "Fuel inconsistencies are common enough. Usually it's just a sensor issue, maybe a small leak, nothing we haven't dealt with 1,000 times before." Harlow's team began by draining samples from various points in the fuel system for testing. Everything appeared normal until they reached the rightmost section of the center tank. As the fuel sample drained into the collection container, Harlow noticed something unusual. The liquid was slightly cloudy, with a faint reddish tint that shouldn't have been present in aviation fuel, which is typically clear with a slight yellowish or straw-colored appearance. "At first, I thought it might be rust or some kind of contamination from the tank itself," Harlow said. "But something about the color. It didn't look like any rust I'd ever seen. It was darker, more organic somehow." Following protocol, Harlow decided to inspect the interior of the tank directly. This is a cumbersome process that requires special equipment, including breathing apparatus, as the environment inside fuel tanks contains harmful vapors even after draining. The access panel was removed, and Harlow, equipped with a flashlight and protective gear, entered the confined space. What he discovered inside defied explanation. Floating in the remaining fuel at the bottom of the tank was something that immediately struck him as biological in nature. Initially, Harlow thought it might be an unfortunate case of wildlife intrusion. Perhaps a bird or small animal had somehow found its way into the system during maintenance at another facility. But as his flashlight beams steadied on the object, the horrific reality became clear. It was a human liver, Harlow stated, his voice trembling even months later when recounting the discovery. "I've seen enough medical documentaries to recognize it." Alongside it were what appeared to be sections of intestine and what I can only describe as fragments of lung tissue. They were just floating there, perfectly preserved in the fuel. The most disturbing aspect wasn't just the presence of human organs inside a sealed aircraft fuel tank, it was their condition. According to Harlow, the organs appeared fresh, as if they had been recently removed from a body. Yet the aircraft had been in service continuously for the past 9 days, making multiple transoceanic flights without any reports of tampering or unauthorized access. Harlow immediately backed out of the tank and sealed off the area, declaring a biohazard situation. Airport authorities were contacted, followed swiftly by local police and eventually the FBI, who took jurisdiction over what was now classified as a potential homicide investigation. The discovery sent shockwaves through the aviation community. How could human remains find their way into one of the most secure and regularly inspected components of a commercial aircraft? And perhaps more disturbingly, who did these organs belong to? Initial forensic analysis confirmed what Harlow had suspected. The remains were indeed human. Specifically, they identified a liver, portions of small intestine, and fragments of lung tissue, all apparently from the same individual based on preliminary DNA testing. The organs showed minimal decomposition despite being submerged in aviation fuel, which contains various chemicals that would typically accelerate tissue breakdown. Dr. Eleanor Reeves, a forensic pathologist brought in to examine the remains, noted something particularly unusual. These organs appear to have been surgically removed, she reported. The cuts are clean, precise. This wasn't a case of traumatic dismemberment. Whoever removed these organs knew what they were doing. This finding only deepened the mystery. If the organs had been surgically removed, that suggested intentionality. Either a medical procedure gone horrifically wrong, or, more disturbingly, a deliberate act. But why would someone place human organs inside an aircraft's fuel tank? And how did they gain access to such a secure system? Transglobal Airways immediately launched an internal investigation, reviewing the maintenance records for N778TG for the past 6 months. According to their documentation, the fuel tanks had last been opened for inspection exactly 72 days prior, during scheduled heavy maintenance in Singapore. Since then, the aircraft had operated 43 flights across 3 continents without any record of the fuel system being accessed. The FBI began interviewing everyone who had been in contact with the aircraft during this period: maintenance workers, ground crew, flight attendants, and pilots. They collected DNA samples to rule out the possibility that the organs belonged to anyone who worked with the plane. None matched. Then came another disturbing development. During the inspection of the fuel tank, investigators discovered a small, almost imperceptible modification to one of the access panels. A secondary opening had been created, camouflaged to look like a standard inspection port, but actually retrofitted to allow access to the tank without breaking the official seals that would indicate tampering. This sophisticated modification would have required not only intimate knowledge of the aircraft's design, but also specialized tools and considerable time to implement. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, said Special Agent Marcus Donovan, who led the FBI investigation. This wasn't opportunistic. It was carefully planned and executed with precision. The question is, why go to such lengths just to place human remains in an aircraft's fuel system? The most logical explanation, that the organs belonged to a victim of foul play, with the perpetrator using the fuel tank as an unusual disposal method, raised more questions than it answered. For one thing, why not dispose of an entire body? Why only specific organs? And why choose such a high-risk, difficult-to-access location when there are countless easier ways to dispose of human remains? As the investigation progressed, authorities ran the DNA profile extracted from the organs through various databases, including those for missing persons and criminal records. No matches were found. The organs belonged to someone who either had never been documented in any system or whose disappearance had never been reported. Then, 27 days into the investigation, a troubling pattern emerged. Investigators discovered that over the past 18 months, 3 other commercial aircraft had experienced unusual fuel consumption issues similar to those reported with N778TG. All 3 planes had operated routes that overlapped with Transglobal's Boeing 777. Specifically, all had made multiple stops at Singapore Changi Airport, where N778TG had undergone its last major maintenance. When these aircraft were inspected, no human remains were found. However, in 2 of the 3 planes, maintenance crews discovered trace evidence of biological material in the fuel filters, microscopic amounts that would have gone undetected during routine checks, but became apparent under forensic scrutiny. DNA testing confirmed these traces matched the organs found in the Transglobal aircraft. The same person's remains had somehow found their way into multiple aircraft, all connecting through Singapore over a period spanning more than a year. By this point, what had begun as a disturbing discovery was evolving into something far more sinister and perplexing. The FBI expanded their investigation to include Singapore authorities, who began reviewing security footage from the maintenance facilities at Changi Airport. Weeks of painstaking analysis yielded a potential breakthrough. Security cameras had captured footage of an unidentified individual accessing the maintenance area during nighttime hours when N778TG was undergoing service. The person wore standard maintenance coveralls and carried appropriate identification, blending in perfectly with the legitimate crew. However, no record existed of this individual being employed by either the airport or any of its contracted maintenance providers. More disturbing still was the timing. This unidentified person was observed entering the hangar at exactly 2:17 in the morning, during a 20-minute window when the regular security patrol was scheduled to be in another section of the facility. They remained in the vicinity of the aircraft for approximately 43 minutes before exiting through a service door that led to a rarely used maintenance tunnel. Singapore authorities attempted to follow the individual's path through the airport's extensive surveillance network, but they seemed to vanish after entering the tunnel. No cameras captured them leaving the airport grounds, leading investigators to speculate that they had intimate knowledge of the facility's blind spots. Facial recognition software was employed to identify the mysterious figure, but the individual had carefully kept their face angled away from cameras, wearing a maintenance cap pulled low and what appeared to be specially designed glasses that reflected light in a way that obscured their features from surveillance systems. This person knew exactly where every camera was positioned, noted Singapore Police Inspector Raymond Tan. They moved through the facility with the confidence of someone who belonged there, but took precise measures to ensure they couldn't be identified. This level of preparation suggests a frightening degree of premeditation. As the investigation continued to unfold, an anonymous source within Transglobal Airways contacted the FBI with information that added yet another layer to the already bewildering case. According to this source, the company had been experiencing a string of unexplained avionics issues across multiple aircraft in their fleet over the past 2 years. These weren't major malfunctions that would compromise flight safety, but subtle anomalies in the plane's electronic systems, flickering displays, momentary communications dropouts, navigation instruments showing brief deviations before correcting themselves. Maintenance crews had chalked these issues up to normal electronic glitches, the kind that occasionally plague even the most sophisticated modern aircraft. But the source revealed that these anomalies followed a pattern. They occurred most frequently on aircraft that had recently undergone maintenance in Singapore and primarily affected systems related to the plane's location reporting capabilities. It was as if something was periodically interfering with the aircraft's ability to accurately report its position, the source claimed.
Not enough to trigger any alarms, just enough to create moments of uncertainty about exactly where the plane was. The FBI began to explore a disturbing possibility. What if the organs in the fuel tank and the electronic anomalies were connected? What if someone was experimenting with ways to temporarily cloak an aircraft's precise location? This theory gained traction when investigators discovered that during each of the electronic anomalies, the affected aircraft had been flying over remote stretches of ocean, areas with minimal radar coverage, where planes rely primarily on their onboard systems to report their positions to air traffic control. Dr. Vasily Korev, an aviation systems specialist consulted by the FBI, offered a potential explanation. Modern aircraft fuel is more than just a combustible liquid. It's an integral part of the plane's thermal management system. It circulates through various components, including some that are adjacent to critical avionics.
If someone introduced specific biological compounds into the fuel, compounds that might alter its electrical conductivity or thermal properties in very subtle ways, it could theoretically create the kind of electronic interference described. But this explanation, while technically plausible, raised an even more disturbing question. Why would someone go to such elaborate lengths? What purpose could possibly be served by such a bizarre and macabre method? The investigation took an even darker turn when authorities received an anonymous message delivered through multiple proxies to obscure its origin. The message was brief but chilling. "The vessels carry more than you know. N778TG was just a test. 16 more are already in flight." Authorities immediately ordered comprehensive inspections of all aircraft that had undergone maintenance in Singapore within the past 2 years. The scope was enormous, potentially hundreds of planes operated by dozens of airlines across the globe. The logistics of such an undertaking were nearly impossible to manage without causing massive disruptions to international air travel. As these inspections began, another development emerged. A genetic specialist working with the FBI made a startling discovery about the DNA recovered from the organs. The genetic profile contained markers that were, in the specialist's words, statistically improbable. "There are patterns in this DNA that don't align with any known ethnic population," explained Dr. Sofia Martinez. "It's as if this individual's genetic code had been altered, for lack of a better term. We're seeing sequences that appear almost engineered rather than naturally occurring." This revelation shifted the investigation in an entirely new and unsettling direction. Were the organs actually from a human being, or were they something designed to appear human while serving some other purpose? As investigators grappled with these questions, reports began coming in from the worldwide inspections. No additional human remains were discovered, but 17 aircraft were found to have the same modified access panel that had been identified on N778TG. Each of these planes had undergone maintenance in Singapore at some point in the past 22 months, though not always at the same facility. More concerning still, each of these 17 aircraft showed trace evidence of the same unusual biological material in their fuel systems. Not complete organs, but microscopic cellular structures with the same anomalous DNA profile found in the original discovery. Aviation authorities around the world were now facing an unprecedented situation: a potential widespread tampering of commercial aircraft with materials of unknown origin and purpose. The public remained largely unaware of the full scope of the investigation, as authorities worked to prevent mass panic while continuing to ensure flight safety. Then, 104 days after Harlow's initial discovery, a Boeing 787 operated by Nordic Air experienced a complete electrical failure while cruising at 37,000 feet over the North Atlantic. For exactly 7 minutes and 22 seconds, the aircraft disappeared entirely from radar and satellite tracking. Its transponder stopped transmitting, and all communications with air traffic control were lost. When contact was re-established, the pilots reported something extraordinary. During those 7 minutes, their instruments had continued to function normally from their perspective. They had no indication that they had essentially vanished from the world's air traffic monitoring systems. According to their instruments, they had maintained their course and altitude without incident. But GPS data recovered after the flight told a different story. During those missing minutes, the aircraft had actually deviated from its course by approximately 83 nautical miles before returning to its original flight path, a maneuver that would have required a significant course change that the pilots insisted never occurred. When the plane landed safely in Reykjavik, it was immediately impounded for inspection. Inside its fuel tanks, investigators found something that sent shockwaves through the entire investigation team. The organs were back, this time a complete set, as if an entire human body had been dissolved or disassembled and distributed throughout the fuel system. But unlike the original discovery, these remains showed signs of having been subjected to extreme conditions. They were partially crystallized, with unusual formations growing from the tissue that one examiner described as almost architectural, like something building itself. DNA analysis confirmed it was the same genetic profile as the original organs found in Denver. It was as if the missing parts of that original person had finally been discovered, transformed by some unknown process. The Nordic Air incident revealed something else. The aircraft had undergone unscheduled maintenance approximately 48 hours before the flight, due to a minor hydraulic issue reported by the previous crew. This maintenance had been performed at a small regional airport in northern Finland by a contractor who had never previously worked on Nordic Air aircraft. When authorities attempted to locate this contractor, they discovered the company existed only on paper, with falsified credentials and documentation. The individual who had performed the maintenance had presented identification belonging to a real aviation technician, a man who, investigators discovered, had died 3 years earlier in a boating accident in the Philippines. His body had never been recovered. As the investigation approached its 6th month, the disparate pieces began to form a disturbing picture. Someone, or some group, with extensive knowledge of aviation systems, airport security, and human biology was conducting a global experiment, using commercial aircraft as unwitting test vehicles. The purpose remained unclear, but the methodical nature of the operation suggested a level of resources and planning that extended beyond ordinary criminal enterprise. The most troubling aspect was the apparent success of whatever was being tested. The Nordic Air incident demonstrated that it was indeed possible to make an aircraft effectively disappear from monitoring systems while in flight, with the pilots completely unaware that anything unusual had occurred. In the wrong hands, such capability presented a frightening national security implication. Despite one of the most extensive investigations in aviation history, involving multiple federal agencies and international cooperation, the identity of the person whose organs were found remains unknown. No missing persons report matches their genetic profile, and the anomalies in their DNA continue to baffle geneticists. James Harlow, the technician who made the initial discovery, has since left the aviation industry. In his final interview before declining all further media requests, he made a statement that continues to haunt those familiar with the case. "I keep thinking about something one of the FBI agents said to me," Harlow recalled. "He asked me if I was absolutely certain about what I saw when I first entered that tank, if I was sure it was organs I was seeing, and not something else that just looked like human tissue. When I assured him I knew what I'd seen, he got this look on his face, and he said, 'The problem is, we can't find any evidence that the person these organs came from ever existed in the first place.' To this day, no one has claimed responsibility for the modifications to the aircraft or the placement of the human remains. The 17 aircraft identified with similar tampering have been either decommissioned or undergone complete overhauls of their fuel systems. International aviation authorities have implemented new security protocols for maintenance facilities and additional inspections specifically targeting fuel system integrity. Yet questions remain. If the organs belonged to someone who, by all official records, never existed, then who or what were they? What was the purpose of distributing human remains throughout the fuel systems of commercial aircraft across multiple continents? And perhaps most disturbingly, was the Nordic Air incident a successful test of whatever capability was being developed? Aviation security experts continue to monitor for signs of similar tampering, but many fear that whoever was responsible has already achieved their objective and moved on to the implementation phase of whatever operation they were preparing. The modified access panels, the surgical precision of the organ placement, the genetic anomalies, and the electronic disruptions all point to a level of sophistication that suggests this was merely the visible portion of a much larger, still hidden endeavor. For the thousands of passengers who board commercial flights each day, there is no way to know if they might be traveling on an aircraft that, for a few minutes during its journey, might simply vanish from the monitoring systems that track the world's air traffic, carrying them to coordinates unknown for purposes that remain obscured. As one senior investigator noted in a classified briefing, later leaked to aviation journalists, "We've been operating under the assumption that we're looking for someone placing human remains in aircraft. What keeps me awake at night is the possibility that we've been wrong from the start. What if we're actually looking at something placing aircraft parts inside humans?" Airports around the world have quietly enhanced their security protocols, particularly surrounding maintenance operations. Fuel samples are now tested not just for contaminants that might affect engine performance, but for biological material that has no logical reason to be there. James Harlow now lives in a small town in rural Montana, as far from any major airport as he could reasonably settle. In his last communication, before completely disconnecting from the investigation, he mentioned something that had been bothering him since that November morning. "The smell," he wrote. "When I first opened that access panel, before I saw anything, there was this smell. Not the normal fuel vapor you'd expect, but something else underneath it. Something sweet, almost like perfume, but wrong somehow. I've never smelled anything like it before or since, but sometimes I swear I catch a hint of it on the wind, even all the way out here in the middle of nowhere. And when that happens, I look up at the contrails in the sky, and I wonder, what's really flying up there now?" The investigation officially remains open, with a small task force continuing to pursue leads. But with each passing day, the trail grows colder, and the true nature of what James Harlow discovered inside that fuel tank that November morning seems increasingly likely to remain one of aviation's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. What would you do if you were a maintenance technician and discovered human remains where they absolutely shouldn't be? And do you believe this was simply a bizarre case of criminal activity, or something much more sinister at work in our skies? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more investigations into aviation incidents that the mainstream media won't touch.